Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Don. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Happy to be presenting today. As some of you might have heard, if you would please put your questions in the chat. Rachel and Don are going to help me monitor that. And so if questions come in, I'll try to make sure we get those things answered for you. Some of you may have heard me speak before. I've been at the HESNI conference a couple of different times. I'm going to talk about some content that we've maybe seen before, but I'm also going to bring some new stuff. And I'm excited to share this story with you. I'd like to start out with this picture that's on the slide. For those of you that may not know, the gentleman on the left there is Dr. Raymond Damadian. And with that piece of equipment, performed the first full body scan in 1977, first full MRI body scan. And I put that picture up to create a framework and talk about aging infrastructure and how we communicate with our non-facility leadership and the value of infrastructure investment. And the point that I'm making here is we would never use this piece of equipment today to diagnose patients and to treat patients. But we also have a lot of infrastructure equipment that's 1977, and maybe some of you have a few that are a little bit older. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Thank you, Rachel. You already introduced me. This is my contact information. Want to share that. And also, just as a quick reference, some of you may know me from past presentations when I was with a company called Facility Health Incorporated. We are now part of the Brightly software group, which is part of Siemens. So there's been a lot of changes there, but I'm happy to be back speaking with you again today. So let's go back to 77 and set the stage. If we go look at 1977, we talked about this MRI. And if we think about other technology at the time, computer, IT, telecommunications, the automotive industry, right? In almost every other segment of our society, we have this thing called planned obsolescence, right? And we understand that assets and equipment, it either becomes technologically obsolete or it just becomes physically obsolete due to aging. And we all know the struggles that we're facing today. Also in 1977, this generator was installed in a hospital in the United States. It's a good old 6V92 Detroit diesel, two cycles, smokes a lot, all that cool stuff, right? That generator is still in use today. This is an active asset out in the vertical here. And that may be okay, right? We don't really know. Has it been maintained properly? How is it performing on the monthly tests? Has it been upgraded or not upgraded, rebuilt, right? We need the data to tell us if that generator is still viable. And we'll talk about energy and decarbonization a little bit later. But the point, again, we're trying to make is this aging infrastructure is a real issue for us all. So quick plug on Brightly. What are we talking about here? Brightly software. We're talking about strategic asset management. And I like to put this definition out there. Some of you may have heard me say before, managing a facility is different than maintaining a facility, right? And we're talking about the management of the maintenance of the physical assets for the full life cycle of the equipment. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about software and data, but it's not just a software play, right? There's processes, there's the culture. For all the owners out there, every hospital has a different culture, different relationship with the C-suite. So we really have to look at that in a more comprehensive fashion. Now, conceptually, what I'd like you to think about, when we view the world and we look at these assets, every asset has a story, right? Age, condition, performance. Are we doing preventive maintenance? Are we seeing a high incidence of break fix? All of that information can be consolidated to tell us a story. How is this asset performing in the facility today, right? And every asset, some are better than others, and so on and so forth. But conceptually, if you think about all the data that you have currently even in your facility, you have the ability to understand how a particular asset is performing. And if we look at that asset, and then we can also take that same data and we can roll that up and we can give a health score, if you will, to the hospital or to the East Wing versus the West Wing. how old is the infrastructure? And the goal here is to try to create a digital image, or not an image, but a digital data flow. That is what otherwise it's an analog process, right? We have maintenance techs that are touching the equipment, working on it, doing the PMs. But we want to make sure we're recording that information, because that's all important for creating a more objective framework for looking at our infrastructure investment. Again, just talking about our space, we do have a computerized maintenance management system, CMMS. That's called the Works Hub. And then we're going to talk more today about another platform called Origin, which is a capital and operational budgeting, forecasting, and strategic planning tool. Now, when we put those two things together, we like to say 1 + 1 = 3. If you have whether it's the Works Hub or any CMMS that you're using, right? I'm going to say CMMS agnostic at this point. The CMMS system is your heartbeat, right? It tells us what's going on in the facility from a maintenance perspective, and it's really the operational intelligence. Now, there's other data sources, your building automation and so on, but in this case, we're really talking about how we're managing that piece of equipment. And then we use that operational intelligence to do the forecasting, right? The data that we can pull from a CMMS system, we can use that in the Origin platform to do more automated forecasting and strategic planning. And I'll show you how those two things come together. Back in May of last year, I did a presentation at the HESNE conference. Maybe some of you saw that, where we did this bucket story, right? We talked about how the money flows through the department. I'm not going to go through all of that in detail, but I do want to reference it because I think there's some key takeaways that set up the rest of the conversation. Macroeconomics, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Everybody on this call knows what's happening in healthcare right now, financially. The financial pressures are real. It's impacting not only our capital budgets, but our operational budgets. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of documentation out there that talks about aging infrastructure. Again, this is not new information to everybody, but we have to keep talking about it because it's real. It's real. If you summarize all that together, what we've been telling folks for years, we know that prior to COVID, infrastructure investment was already a tough battle, right? We've historically underinvested in our infrastructure in healthcare, and it continues to age. And that certainly was the case during the COVID years, right? The financial projections today suggest that we're going to be in the soup here for a couple more years at least. And so securing and allocating budgets is going to continue to be a battle. It's going to get harder, not easier. In my own opinion, I don't think it's ever going to be easy. I think we're going to be in this for a long, long time. So our goal then is to transform. How can we think about this in a different way? And how can we tell our story in a different way? When we look at the buckets, in this case, I'm highlighting again the Works Hub, but any CMMS system, right? Your CMMS system today, a lot of work is being done, right? And if you look at these blue buckets, we're talking about compliance, all the rounding, inspection, testing, and maintenance, your preventive maintenance, which is a requirement for accreditation, general operations, tracking your energy costs, just the overall operation of the assets, management. That's a fixed cost. And we want to think about this in financial terms. That's the minimum amount of work that we have to do just to occupy the building, right? And those are real dollars. I'm going to show you some benchmark numbers here in a few minutes. In the yellow buckets, we have our break fix, right? This is our work orders. How many work orders are you processing every year? How much time is being assigned to those work orders? What's your spend on contracted services if you're using service providers to do work for you? And then, of course, we have asset failure. We don't like to see that, but it's a real scenario. And what I wanted to highlight here is that performing break fix work orders and replacing assets after they have failed, we're not actually really enhancing the building, we're just restoring operations. So if you think about all of the investment in these buckets, these are non-discretionary costs. This is mandatory. When stuff breaks, we have to fix it, right? And my point of this is the best we can do in these areas is seek to do the work as efficiently as possible, but there's really nothing here that we can decide not to do, okay? And that's going to be important when we talk about some other finances. The other thing we have is this, what I call the discretionary spend, right? This is the proactive stuff. On the capital side, this is the proactive replacement of assets. It's our capital budget, right? We want to replace air handler 21. We know it's aging. We know it's starting to fail. We're having a lot of issues. We're spending a ton of money to keep this thing running. It's time for a new one, right? Also, we have a lot of money that we can spend, or I'm sorry, a lot of opportunities to invest operationally, doing thermal scans on our switchgear, doing thermal scans on the roofs, having a roofing contractor come in and do proactive, predictive, or preventive maintenance on the roofs. There's a lot of things that we would like to do as facility people that can dramatically improve the performance of the assets that we have and or the building. To me, this is the budget battleground, folks. This is the money that we have to work the hardest to secure. But in order to do so, we have to understand how much we're spending on the mandatory side. The other thing that we often recommend tracking, not often, we always recommend tracking it, is how much deferred maintenance do you have in your facility? How old is your equipment? How is it performing? And the longer we run on aging infrastructure, the larger this bucket gets. Now, these are assets that are not necessarily in imminent failure mode, but they're aging. And that bucket, understanding how many assets we have in that bucket, if you will, that's an indication of risk. Because we all know that as the facility ages, we see a higher risk profile and a higher potential for emergent repairs, failures, and so on and so forth. The point here, folks, is it's important to communicate the objective reality. Where are we today? It may or may not change the game, but I think it's our job as facility leaders to communicate that information to our non-facility leadership. Long story short, what happens over time when we continue to underinvest? We'd like to see on the left a balanced spend. We're always going to have some assets that are in deferred status. We just don't want those to be the most critical assets to facility performance. But properly spending or having the ability to spend across all of these buckets is important. But over time, as we continue to reduce the green spend, and I don't mean the sustainability, but the good spend, right? The proactive investment, we start to see that deferred bucket grow. And when we get too far down the road, when the deferred maintenance exceeds 60, 70% of the assets, what we start to see is a failing facility or a totally reactive facility. And what happens here? We're spending all of our time fighting fires, right? We've lost the ability to do proactive strategic investment. Some of you may have experienced this in your careers. Maybe you're experiencing it today. But this is kind of the harsh reality of the trend that we've seen in the industry. So that sets the stage then for how we want to tell the story in a different way. Kind of restating, where does this data come from, your CMMS and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that here in a little bit. So let's step back. Let's do a little finance discussion. The C-suite, they don't get it, right? We've said it, I've said it, we've heard it when we talk about facilities, and it's very easy to sit and look at the C-suite and say, they just don't get it. They don't understand what we do. And that's true to a certain extent. They don't understand boilers, chillers, heat exchangers, expansion tanks, switchgear. They don't understand that. But if you step back from that and really look at what is important to the C-suite, CFOs by nature are the most risk-averse people on the planet, in my opinion, right? They have a fiduciary responsibility to protect the financial assets of the hospital or the health system, and they do understand risk. So it is not our job to tell the CFO that they're making the wrong decision if they choose to fund a new MRI instead of an air handler. But it is our job to explain to them, this is the impact of that decision. Now we have to hope that they truly make the best decision for the organization. But I want to back away from this idea that they're wrong and we're right. We all should have the same goals for the organization. So the concept here is, let's think about this in a different way. Let's learn to talk about risk and business impact as opposed to just engineering speed. So it kind of boils down to miscommunication, right? I can't gauge feedback from the group. This always makes me chuckle a little bit in terms of how we interact with our CFO and with the C-suite. But I was thinking about this a few months ago, like, why is that? Why does this miscommunication exist? And I settled on this idea: cost center, right? So we all know that facilities is a cost center, and we have been trained for our entire careers. We're a cost center. We don't generate revenue. There is no return on investment for infrastructure investment, right? There's no ROI. I want to challenge that a little bit. So I went and actually Googled. I mean, I know what a cost center is, but I Googled it. What is the definition of a cost center? And to me, this was kind of shocking when I really looked at the words. So a cost center is a function within an organization that does not directly add to profit, but still costs money to operate, such as HR, IT, whatever, right? Not going to get into the HR and IT game, but this is a pretty negative perspective of what we do. And if this is the definition that's in your CFO's head, well, we've got some work to do, right? Another definition: the main use of a cost center is to track actual expenses for comparison to budget. If that doesn't get you excited to get out of bed every day and go to work, I don't know what does, right? That's terrible. We do so much more. It's not just our job to track expenses in comparison to budget. That's a pretty negative view. The manager for a cost center is only responsible for keeping costs in line with budget and does not bear any responsibility regarding revenue or investment decisions. Wow, right? That's a scary concept. I don't like that one either. But this is the battle that we're fighting. Now this one, a cost center indirectly contributes to a company's profit via operational excellence, customer service, and enhanced product value. Now that one I can get behind, right? I like that, and that's what I want to explore here in the session today. I love this quote, and I ask you to keep it in mind. Price is what you pay, value is what you get. And so this is all about, instead of talking about cost and price and how much are we going to have to spend, I want to translate this into value discussion. What is the value of that investment, right? So my challenge question to you: does your non-facility leadership understand the work that you do, right? And then I add a couple of words and say, does your non-facility leadership understand the value of the work that you do? Just a couple of words difference, but it's two totally different questions, right? So sometimes we just need to look at things from a different perspective, right? I want to challenge you to think about your facility, treat it in your own mind as a profit center. Whether your CFO sees it as a profit center or not, let's think about, how do we manage the facility, but how do we communicate what it is that we do and hopefully increase that value perspective. So this is a definition of a profit center. I would not suggest that you challenge your CFO into a discussion or a debate on whether facilities generates direct revenue or not. That's not the point. but the mindset of understanding that we are so closely tied to revenue, you know, you can't do an MRI scan. The MRI may be fine, but if we don't have power, or we don't have climate control, or we don't have those things, then we can't generate that revenue. So we're just a little bit removed from the direct revenue. And again, I want to challenge us to think differently. So when we're running a business, just any business, think of any business. Maybe some of you have stuff on the side or whatever. There's two ways to grow a business, right? Reduce costs or increase revenue. Now, this is not a secret to everybody on the call, right? But a perpetual cost cutting strategy, you cannot, it's a race to the bottom. We can continue to push down costs and push down costs. And yes, we have to do better, but I'm kind of tired of the thought we have to do more with less, right? It begs the question, how much more do we have to do with how much less? Because we can't continue down that path. So if you translate this into the facility world, right? We talked about the buckets. We can't reduce costs any further than this line. Now we can do incremental things, right? We can find energy savings. We can do our jobs a little bit more efficiently, but I would suggest that a lot of organizations are already doing the best they can to make those changes. So that leaves us again with those green buckets and quote unquote increasing the revenue for our facilities. Now, what's our revenue? Our revenue is our budget, right? So we have to rethink, not just asking for more money, but we've got to sell, right? We've got to communicate in ways that hopefully we can increase that revenue, right? And now we have our debt, right? Our deferred maintenance, if you think about it in financial terms, think about it as your debt. That's the debt that we have to service, right? We're going to have to pay that bucket off sometime. And we don't want to do it in an emergent situation. We'd rather do it in a proactive and planned, with a proactive and planned approach. So hopefully that gives you a framework, at least. What's your CFO thinking about, right? And what's important to them. Now, by the numbers, I'm going to put a couple of numbers up here, right? And we're going to talk about these relationships. And so when I look at the data that we've collected over the last 8 years in Origin, we've got some really nice benchmarking on the capital side. And then we're working on more operational benchmarking. I'll show those numbers in the next slide. But what we're seeing across the country in all the facilities that we've been in, about 50% of all the infrastructure assets are in that deferred status, meaning they've exceeded industry expected useful life. They may or may not be in imminent failure mode, but again, that's risk. So on average, 50% of the capital assets in your facility are probably in this deferred status. I've seen a lot better and I've seen a lot worse. But if I walk into a new hospital today, I assume about 50%. Now, this has gone up in the last 3 years. We were trending around 41% as a national average. And we're starting to see here this number's increasing pretty significantly, in part at least due to the capital freezes and so on that we've all been through in the last 3 years. Let's talk about the operational side. So this is data that I'm pulling from a friend of mine. His name's Dr. Stephen Call. He's got a PhD in facility management, if you can believe that, right? He's been doing a bunch of national benchmarking on the operational side. And the data that I have seen from him is about $10 to $11 a square foot as a kind of a benchmark on total operational spend. And then you have to add in another $3 to $4 a square foot on the energy side. So we all know energy's gone up a lot. That's killing us right now. But if you put all those things together, we're talking about $10 to $15 a square foot, probably in the Chicago market and northeastern, Illinois. We're probably even higher due to labor rates, energy costs, and so on. So these are some big numbers. If we start to break that down, if the energy number, let's say $3 to $4 a square foot, and we start to fill in these buckets, and this is not the answer, okay? This is an answer. So please don't take these numbers and go quote them and say, we need to be at $3 a square foot on this or whatever. I want to be careful about that. But what I'm starting to work on with clients is, how do we break that $10 to $15 a square foot on the operational side? What is that allocation between those buckets, right? And then we look at our deferred maintenance and our capital. Those numbers, you can quote me on, because I've got the data to back those up, right? But what I'm driving at here, folks, is there's a relationship between these buckets. Now, an easy relationship to look for, preventive maintenance. Now, remember, preventive maintenance is a mandatory thing. Whether you're doing OEM maintenance or AEM maintenance, you still have to perform preventive maintenance from a compliance perspective. We know that the amount of preventive maintenance that we do can impact our work orders, our break fix, right? Theoretically, at least, the more preventive stuff we do, the less break fix. What I typically see in facilities is it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. 2 to 3 times the number of break fix work orders as compared to preventive maintenance. What we'd like to see, obviously, is if we can shift, do more preventive work, less break fix. That's a hard thing to navigate, I know. But also the preventive maintenance can impact our deferred, and it certainly impacts our capital spend. And I'll show you how those numbers come together. So if I take this all together, and then, by the way, add in the fact that these are all interrelated, right? If we spend more on energy, it impacts our ability to spend on something else. So what I'm driving at here, folks, is to the best of your ability, whether it's with software or using your fingers and toes, right? Try to understand where the money is flowing in your facility and what are those relationships, so that, again, we can have a more effective conversation with our leadership. So just to give you some benchmark numbers on that preventive maintenance concept, if I look at a 1 million square foot facility, a typical 1 million square foot campus, we've got, we might have 500,000 square feet, 600,000 square feet of acute space. We're going to have some non-acute stuff. Just take a 1 million square foot campus as a benchmark. We're going to see about 1,300 capital assets. Now, you might have 20,000 assets in your work order system. All your life safety components, garbage disposals, ice machines, microwave ovens, whatever. What I'm talking about here are the major capital assets: the boilers, the chillers, all that stuff, right? The air handlers. The total replacement value for those 1,300 assets, it's going to be in the ballpark of about $140 million. And if you apply that deferred maintenance number, you're going to see about $50 to $60 million worth of deferred assets in your portfolio. Those are big numbers. And what we're suggesting to people is we would have to spend anywhere from $3 to $6 million annually, or $3 to $6 a square foot annually. And that means every year, let's say for the next 10 years, that's kind of the minimum spend to keep the facility from aging further. And depending on if you're at 3 to 6, if we want to impact the age of the facility and try to drive it back down, we've got to spend more, right? I mean, it's obvious, but these are some pretty significant numbers. Now, when I look at the operational side, we can quantify the ability to fund preventive maintenance, not the fancy stuff, just the basic preventive maintenance. Could be anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million a year, just to perform all the filter changes, the lubing the bearings, checking the belts on the air handle, all that stuff, right? We're talking about $500,000 to $1 million a year, $500,000 to $1 million a year, maybe more in your facility. And then I want to reference a JLL study that was published. It's actually been about 6 years ago now, but it's still very valid. And they tried to quantify the financial benefits of preventive maintenance. And what I'm looking at here is the degradation and the expected useful life impact of preventive maintenance. And what they're suggesting here is if we don't do preventive maintenance, we can see a degradation in the life anywhere from 20 to 50%. Now, practically speaking, you know, how long is your chiller going to run if you don't do any PMs on it? There's no way you're going to get 20 years out of it, right? So if we think about the more PM we do, not just does it make the equipment run better and reduce our work orders, but it extends the life of the equipment, which thus impacts our capital needs. So if you take all this data together and put it into kind of an ROI type calculation, what I did here is I ran a 10-year capital plan for a 1 million square foot facility, and I simulated 0 PM if you look in the upper left-hand corner. And what this is telling us is that we would have a forecast capital need of over 10 years of close to $99 million, right? And then I ran the same scenario, the same assets, and I said, what if we did 100% preventive maintenance? This is a mathematical model, folks, but what we're saying is, imagine adjusting the expected useful life of every asset in your portfolio by 20%. And what that means is a $78 million capital need over the next 10 years versus a $99 million capital need. And that's all just based on projecting how long the equipment is going to last. What that does for us is it gives us the ability then to say, for, in this case, for $500,000 a year invested on the OpEx side from a PM perspective, we're impacting about $2 to $2.5 million per year in capital needs. And over 10 years, it gets us up to that $20 to $25 million range. That's an ROI, right? Now that's a way to communicate that the more PMs that we can do, and we need more staff to do it, but it's a relatively small spend compared to the financial benefits of that longer term perspective. Now, what we saw during COVID, everybody I think experienced that. We froze capital, and then we, in some cases, we cut staff, we deferred, or you know, we had early retirements. We had a lot of those or furloughed. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. We had early retirements and so on and so forth. Financially, cutting staff in the middle of a capital freeze, which thus prohibits our ability to do you know, some of the discretionary work, advancing and improving the assets, it's honestly one of the worst financial decisions that we could have made. Now, don't say that to your CFO, right, directly, but as I say to people, you know, it's like sitting with your spouse and saying, we need a new car. We can't afford a new car, right? We don't have the capital. So let's stop changing the oil in the car we have today so we can save a little money, right? Doesn't make sense. But again, we have to look for different ways to communicate that story. So before I go into the next session, I'm going to take a break or take a pause for a second and ask, are there any questions, Don or Rachel? Is there any feedback from the team that I haven't been able to see? I can answer those questions before we go to the next section.
Hi, Mark. I'm looking at the Q&A, and at this time, there is no questions.
Okay, cool. Well, if you do have questions, folks, please submit those. I want to make sure and answer those questions because I can't see, I can't interact with you as much as I'd like. Thank you, Rachel.
Yep.
So shifting gears then in terms of communicating value. Got ahead of myself. How many of you are in sales, right? Think of yourself from a facility perspective. What we're talking about here is you have to sell, right? We have to sell to our non-facility leadership. And I gave away the joke, obviously. When we think of salespeople, right, we think of this. And I know I've seen the attendee list. I know there's a few sales folks out there, so please don't be offended. But what I want to talk about here is not transactional sales, right? I want to talk about high value relationship sales. And if for the facility owners out there, think of the people that you do business with. You do business with organizations and salespeople that you have a trusted relationship, and you buy services from them hopefully because you see value in the work that they can do for you. And in this case, I want you to think of your CFO not as your CFO, they're your customer. So if you're running your facility and you are asking your CFO to give you money, you're asking that person to buy from you. You're asking that person to give you money for the services that you provide, right? So just like those annoying salespeople that call you, right? How many people are asking your CFO for money every day, right? So again, it's important to reach out and build a relationship, and again, talk about that value. So I think the best salespeople, and you know, my own experience in terms of my customers and working with them, sometimes I'm part of educating my customers. What are the different ways that we can help them? I also learn from my customers. My customers teach me a lot, right? And that's a great way to engage your CFO. Ask them to teach you, right? What's important to them? What keeps them up at night, right? And try to make that a more collaborative engagement. So let's talk about how can we educate a customer? In this case, our C-suite, right? So this is some work that I'm doing with a customer down in Texas. Just to give you kind of a footprint, it's about a 1.5 million square foot site, built in 1963, sounds familiar. And what we started to do, working with them, and we're going through their compliance binder, if you will, and going line by line, saying, how much are you spending on each one of these things? And this is just the first cut, right? We've just scratched the surface, but I put this up as a different way to think about it. Think about everything you do on a daily basis that's mandatory, right? Rounding, fire door inspections, fire alarm, fire extinguishers, ice machines, the list goes on and on. Do you know how much you're spending on each one of these line items? And then what's the value of each one of those? Now, maybe the value is we want to pass our next accreditation survey, but that's very valuable, right? Loss of accreditation definitely can impact revenue for your facility, right? So again, understanding not just what you do, what is it costing you to do those things? And then what's the value? What's the payback on all of these things, right? Every facility is going to have a different story. So what we did with this client is we started building our buckets, right? And this is data that they gave me and said, generally in looking at their budgeting process, this is kind of how their scenario breaks down. Total compliance, total energy cost, preventive maintenance, management, right? That's a big chunk. And then the corrective maintenance. Now, these numbers are a little bit different than the numbers that I showed you. And the point is, there is no singular correct answer for your facility that I can tell you or anybody else can tell you. Every facility is different. I'm encouraging you to look inside your facility and see, can you break down these costs? Do you understand where that money's flowing? Okay. Now, communicating this with your non-facility leadership transparently and objectively, I think can create a more trusted engagement, right? Understanding how the money's flowing through your facility is a strong indication to your leadership that you're managing your facility. You know the financial performance of the facility department, right? That's a big step forward. So as we establish credibility, then we want to, credibility leads to value. So this is, now we're engaging our customer, right? We're starting to speak to them in terms that they can understand. And as an example, this is a kind of a simple example, but it was kind of fun to put together. Sorry, don't know what happened there. So a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who works for a diesel fuel treatment company, right? We were talking about this very issue. And he was talking about the struggles that he was having in working with customers that were struggling to get funding just to do some basic operational stuff, right? Polishing the diesel fuel, chemically treating the fuel. So I said, let's build a value chain. Let's connect that spend all the way through the organization, right? So what I did as an example, I took a subset of our database, looked at a large health system and it's about 23 million square feet, 29 hospitals, plus a whole bunch of acute properties. And I looked in the system, how many tanks did they have, right? 114 tanks across the portfolio, day tanks, belly tanks, storage tanks, whatever, right? All in 426,000 gallons of diesel fuel owned by this customer. Now, I'm not taking into account the fact that you're burning off some fuel as part of your, whether you have true emergency power situations or just in your normal testing and so on. But if you just think about that, 426,000 gallons of fuel. Now, the price that the guy quoted me just for the chemical treatment, about 13 cents a gallon, right? So $55,000, $60,000 a year just for the chemicals to keep the diesel fuel as clean as we can. We're not talking about the mechanical stuff and the filtration, but let's say $55,000 in chemical treatment, right? $55,000 in treatment is protecting 426,000 gallons of fuel at $5 a gallon. That's $1.7 million worth of diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is an asset, right? And I went one step further, looked at all the generators, and they had a few diesel fire pumps as well. $67 million worth of infrastructure equipment that's dependent on that diesel fuel, right? So if you look to the right-hand side, what I'm trying to do here, I'm not going to say it's necessarily a direct ROI, although I think it kind of is, but it's a value multiplier. So for $55,000 a year, I can protect $1.7 million worth of diesel fuel, and I can at least protect this part of $67 million worth of generators and fire pumps. And then what's the liability and the revenue impact if we lose a generator because of dirty fuel? And you say it'll never happen. It happens. And I'm sure you've all heard the stories, right? You suck dirty fuel into a generator and you grenade that thing, you've created a whole mess for yourself, right? So this is a value chain. For the hospital that we talked about in Texas, I did the same thing for them, right? Just to kind of cement this for a 1.5 million square foot campus. It's a few $1,000s a year in chemicals, $112,000 worth of fuel. The value chain works. So my point here, folks, is think about for all the work that you do, see if you can create that value chain for the organization. So finally, value leads to inclusion, and I'll wrap up here in a couple minutes because I want to leave time for questions. We want to partner with our customer, right? Now, folks, you can do all this perfectly. You still may not get the money you need. You probably won't, right? But if you ask any salesperson, they don't win every deal, right? The point is we have to establish the relationship, and we want to partner with our customers. So the final piece here, and this is a pro tip. I encourage all of my customers, every presentation that you do, every time you communicate with your team, every time you communicate with your C-suite, start your presentation with the mission, vision, and values of the organization, right? These are publicly stated values that the organization is putting out on the market, saying this is what's important to us. So the hospital that we talked about, their mission, make life better for children. So you probably figured out it's a children's hospital. Their values are listed there on the right. And then more importantly, they have made a commitment publicly to sustainability. I'm not going to get into the politics of sustainability, but everybody's getting on the train, right? Our mission, this is a quote from the CEO, our mission is to make life better for children. We have the responsibility to help give children the right start in a healthy environment, reducing our carbon footprint. You guys can read the rest, right? This is the CFO saying this is an important initiative for us. Now, where am I going with this? If you look nationally, 61 health systems, hospitals and health systems have signed a White House decarbonization pledge, right? To reduce carbon emissions 50% by 2030. Now, some of my customers are on this list, and I talked to the facility folks. Did the CEO ask you how much this was going to cost before they made this pledge, right? Because after you do your LED lighting projects, which those are big enough, right, in terms of effort and work and cost, the payback is great. What's next? We cannot significantly change the energy performance, the decarbonization, you pick however you want to talk about that, without a transformational level of investment. And those of you that are running organizations with 30, 40, 50-year-old energy plants, you know what I'm talking about, right? But there's a long list here. Some of you may even be on the list, I'm not sure. But this is a big deal. So use that, though, if you can, because the best way I can think to deal with deferred maintenance is we have to tie those old assets to something bigger than just we need to replace air handler 21, right? Air handler 21 serves an operating room. Air handler 21 is an energy hog, right? Whatever those frameworks are that you can use, what I'm driving at here is when we're talking about infrastructure projects, as engineers and facility folks, we usually talk about what it is, right? We assume that everybody knows what a chiller is. We assume that everybody knows what an air handler is. I like to follow this train of thought. What is it? It's an air handler. More importantly, what does it do, right? Every asset in your building was put there for a reason. It performs a function. It does something to support the facility. So why is it important, right? And then what is the risk and impact if it fails? And I'm not talking about probability of failure. What's the business impact if a particular asset fails? And that's that value chain. And then finally, how does it align with other strategic initiatives? If you can tie the infrastructure itself to the mission, vision, and values of the organization, the stated goals of the organization, again, you may not get everything you want, but at least hopefully you can earn a seat at the big table where those strategic investment decisions are made. So final slide, WIFM. If you've never heard this before, what's in it for me? Well, think about it from a CFO, C-suite perspective. What's in it for them? What's important to them, right? And all I can suggest here, if you don't already have a direct line of communication with your administrators and your C-suite folks, do the best you can to build that relationship. Learn what they do, learn what they have to deal with, and seek ways that you can align your needs with their needs, right? And hopefully advance that relationship. So I know we're here at the end of the hour, so I'll stop again and ask for any questions. I know I went through this quickly, but I hope it was helpful. Rachel or Don, I don't know if we have any questions from the group. I'd be happy to answer though if we can.
Hi, Mark. Still no questions, but we have 3 comments.
Okay.
One is everything he is saying is on point. Another one is great content so far. And another one is I like the card comparison.
Well, thank you. Whoever made the comments, I appreciate that. I'm happy to share more information on that. But I love the car concept, right? Use your fingers, use your toes, tell the story as best you can, and don't assume that the people you're talking to understand all the details of what you're talking to them about. So try to meet them where they are, I guess, not where you want them to be. And hopefully that education helps. So I appreciate those comments and the feedback. Any other questions or comments?
Please write them in either the chat screen or the Q&A.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll hang out here for a second. But as we're wrapping up, I'll leave you with one last slide. And I have to say this to everybody on the call, whether you're a supplier, an owner, thank you for everything that you do. We're all in a really, really tough spot right now. And it's going to be tough for a while to, for years to come, let's say. So I appreciate the chance to share my story. Hopefully you got some good tips and tricks out of this. Please do reach out if you have any more questions. And I always like to leave with this slide. Some of you maybe have seen it before. Never give up, folks. It's hard work, but appreciate all that you do, and hopefully you get a little laugh out of this too.
Good.
So,
Okay.
all right.
I just want to insert quickly here, we expect to have a video of today's entire presentation posted on our website the next day or two. We'll send you a notice when it's available, along with today's slide deck.
Yep.
The PowerPoint presentation. Our next webinar, as Rachel pointed out, is coming up in a couple of weeks on April 5th. It'll be noon time again, so Wednesday, April 5th. And it's going to be on working in healthcare critical occupied spaces. We have a pair of field supervisors or superintendents from Machuta Construction are going to perform this talk for us. Watch our email. Registration is open now at hesney.org. And other than that, thank you, Mark. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
I think we have questions. I have a couple questions come in, so let's try to get these quickly.
Yep.
How can we get any of this done without employees?
Oh man, you're gonna hit me with the tough one. Well, that's not an easy answer, right? I think the challenge, well, there's two different things, right? Either you don't have the budget, you can't hire them, or that you can't find them. Those are two different issues. I think where the industry is going, and this is, I guess, a shout out to all the folks in the supplier community. I think inevitably organizations are going to have to continue to outsource certain services. I don't mean wholesale outsource, to the JLLs and the Sodexos. That is an option, of course. I call it hybrid outsourcing. I would encourage all of the associate members. We have to be providing solutions. In some cases, it may be managed services. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to value, right? We have to communicate the value of whatever those services are. And I would encourage the associate members, work with your owners to help them define that value and hopefully make it a partnership. But I think inevitably, hospitals and health systems can't do it alone anymore. We're just not going to have the staff. So we've got to look at different models, different business models to get the work done. So that's an answer. I know it's not the answer, but I do appreciate the question.
Okay, one more, Mark. This is really more in the form of a comment from Tom Johnson. I find giving senior leadership a tour of the assets in the mechanical, I find giving senior leadership a tour of the assets in the mechanical rooms to be valuable in future discussions about infrastructure investments.
Excellent comment. I couldn't agree more. And I probably could have even mentioned that too. So Tom, thank you. It's good to hear from you. Thank you for bringing that to the attention. I have a customer in the Carolinas that actually got a 2-hour time block with the CFO, drew a picture on took out a Sharpie, drew a picture on a piece of paper about how we get cool air to a patient room, all the way from the cooling tower through the VAV. Then took the CFO on a tour and showed them the complexity of the system. What does it take to get cool air into a patient room? And he said it was a game changer. The CFO really got some value, at least in understanding the complexity. And his comment was, I just figured it was like the air conditioner in my house, right? And we know that it's not. So Tom, well said, and keep up the good work. I really appreciate that.